One of the most surprising things about Japan, and there are many surprising things, is quite how safe it is. See, Japan is one of the few countries in the world where you can leave an iPhone X in a coffee shop and the only thing you've got to worry about is dropping by the next day to get it. Because, dear viewer, it is almost certain that your recently released brand new iPhone X will be there waiting for you the next day. And I'm not even exaggerating here. Also, Japan is a beautiful country with amazing sights where everything seems to be exactly where it should be. But as you know, this is not a travel channel, and this video is indeed not sponsored by Japan's Ministry of Tourism. So let us get right to the point here. Recently, we all found out that Emperor Akihito has decided to abdicate.
The Emperor of Japan will step down on April 30th, 2019, the first abdication by a Japanese monarch in 2 centuries.
Well, see, this emperor came to the throne almost 30 years ago in 1989, just when the Great Japanese Crisis began. So no, in Japan the emperor has no power, so Akihito wasn't responsible, but don't say that can't be just coincidence and bad luck. We can practically say that it was after Akihito's arrival that 30 years of stagnation began. And in this video, we're going to see what happened, what caused this great crisis, and why the German economic model has managed to defeat the Japanese model. But first, dear viewer, let's have a small history lesson.
Miracles exist.
Japan and Germany are two very interesting countries with a lot in common and also many differences. After the Second World War, both countries were literally in ruins. They had lost not only their infrastructure, but also an entire generation. However, despite this, between the 1950s and the 1970s, both countries experienced such a powerful takeoff that in those 2 decades they not only managed to recover, but become 2 of the largest economies in the world, as well as 2 of the richest countries. In fact, even though it might seem incredible today, for years it was speculated that Japan could surpass even the United States as the world's largest economy, and oh, how things have changed. The fact is that between 1955 and 1973, Japan grew at an average rate of 9% a year, and between 1973 and 1990, above 4%. These are really, truly incredible rates. And Germany didn't stay behind. It had an average growth rate of 7% for almost 30 years. Both countries were at full throttle, their factories worked tirelessly, there was no unemployment, and both Germans and the Japanese saved and invested their money all over the world. Suddenly, Japanese and German companies became famous worldwide. This was very important, especially for Japan, a country that lives constantly under nature's threat. Besides being a very mountainous country, Japan suffers from all kinds of natural disasters, earthquakes, cyclones, tsunamis, etc., etc., etc. By the way, in a future VisualPolitik video, hit subscribe, we're going to tell you all about how these 2 economic miracles took place. Well, the fact is that in 1989, this entire economic takeoff stopped. It came to an end and gave way to what is known as the Great Japanese Stagnation.
Forget Greece. Japan is the world's real economic time bomb. Christopher Matthews, an Axios reporter.
I'm pretty convinced this isn't news to you, as it isn't strange to hear people talk about Japan along with the word crisis. Yet ever since I can recall, Japan has been the country of eternal crisis, the country that has 1 good year for every 3 bad ones. In fact, nowadays we can easily declare Germany the winner in the growth race that both countries maintained for decades. See, today Germany, which has also gone through some bad times in recent decades, is richer, has healthier public accounts, is more competitive internationally, and has higher wages. To get an idea of Japan's situation, I think we can use 2 very revealing facts. First, in Japan, real wages, which take into account inflation, are lower today than salaries back in 1990, which was 30 years ago. And second, the Japanese government's public debt is the highest in the world, 250% of GDP. Yes, we didn't screw that up. That is really the debt figure. So Devere, you might now be wondering, well, what the hell happened? What made the German model so much better than the Japanese? Well, obviously there are lots of reasons, but we believe that 3 of them are by far the most important. So we're going to take a look at them right now.
A problematic model.
First, we can say that there was a big difference between Japan and Germany's development. The country of the rising sun opted to protect large industrial conglomerates, the Keiretsu. The Keiretsu are, so to speak, holdings that do practically everything. That is, they have companies for all kinds of things: cars, planes, tires, even toothpaste. Everything is manufactured by the same holding company, whose companies support each other, buy and sell products between themselves, and even have their own banks to finance themselves. So what's the problem with this? Well, these large conglomerates tended to be very bureaucratic and not very flexible. So decision-making was a very difficult and slow process. But the Japanese government decided to compensate them for all of these disadvantages and didn't hesitate to give the Keiretsu all kinds of advantages and privileges. For example, Japan's central bank financed them generously at abnormally low rates through specific programs. However, the results, they were not good. See, these large groups became very influential in the country's politics. They also had many problems because, of course, when one of these conglomerates' companies did badly, it was extremely easy for them to infect the rest. They were also in a lot of debt, and they even limited competition. I mean, how can one compete with such groups if they are also protected by the government and have all kinds of privileges? It's a pretty hard thing to ask. On the other hand, in Germany, the political commitment was completely different and focused on creating a very competitive market with small and medium-sized companies. But are there large industrial groups in Germany? Well, of course there are, and that's a good thing as long as they don't depend on the government or receive privileges that impede competition. So while Germany's companies thrived, Japan's large conglomerates have had many problems, and most have disappeared or broken down at some point. But that's not all.
The discount policy.
For years, Japanese politicians thought that in order to export more, devaluing the currency from time to time was not a bad thing. However, in 1985, the real problems began. See, as a result of all these currency wars, the United States gained a fairly large external deficit. And because Washington politicians of the time, as they do now, didn't like it, they forced the so-called Plaza Accord, an agreement between the United States, Japan, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, to depreciate the dollar to decrease the trade deficit. As you can imagine, this was a huge blow to the Japanese industry, who was used to competing with a little bit of help. And then the government sank its interest rates and began boosting credit like there was no tomorrow. And the result of this, well, that was a huge debt spiral, banks distributing money like crazy, and a massive bubble in the real estate and financial markets. And you know what happened next? Well, in 1990, this entire house of cards began to collapse. In Germany, however, as we also saw here at VisualPolitik, the government opted to maintain a strong mark, their currency at the time, which on one hand forced companies to compete in productivity and innovation, but on the other allowed them to buy foreign technology and machines under better terms. But, dear viewer, there is still a third and determinant difference.
Locked within themselves.
Japan is the most elderly country in the world. Just over 25% of its population, that is every 1 in 4 Japanese people, are over 65. And for every hour that passes, the country's population drops by 50 people. In fact, the Japanese government expects the country's population to fall below 100 million people by the year 2050. And of course, the more elderly citizens there are, the less young people there are, and the lower the population. This has clear consequences. For one, more public spending on pensions and healthcare, and for another, less labor. True, many other countries have this problem, but Japan's case is by far the most serious, and this isn't by chance at all. Japanese companies have compensated for all of the problems caused by the bad policies that we talked about in this video. They force their employees to work longer hours than in other developed countries, which obviously leaves very little time to think about starting a family. And what's more, while some countries, like Germany, have favored the arrival of immigrants who tend to have higher population growth rates, Japan has closed its doors. In fact, when international organizations tell Japan they have to open their borders to immigration to face the aging problem, the Japanese government has even said this.
Japan's finance minister tells elderly they should hurry up and die to help reduce country's rising welfare bill.
So, these are the fundamental causes that have led Japan to live in continuous crisis, and the causes that have made the German model clearly better than the Japanese one. So now over to you. Do you think that Japan will be able to overcome this period of stagnation and seemingly permanent crisis? Well, leave your answer in the comments below as well as in this survey, and I also really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for brand new videos every Monday and Thursday. Also, do not forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine, and as always, thank you for watching.